Even from a distance, this tranquil island appears more of a tourist destination than a military outpost. Walking down its cobblestone streets and past its monuments, there are few signs that Gotland was once regarded as the tip of Sweden's sword. Now, as it hosts the country's largest war games in 20 years, it's being sharpened dramatically.
It's in the middle of the Baltics, and it is a part of Sweden which will be important to defend in basically all scenarios that we can come up with.
A hypothetical first strike by an enemy on Sweden could target Gotland. And that's why the military and emergency workers are training together.
This is the aftermath of an attack that would provoke an all-out war. All of the victims in this scenario are members of the Red Cross. This exercise is not only about military and civilian units working together, but also about getting people who are critically injured to hospital.
Gotland was demilitarized following the end of the Cold War. These officers showed us one of the secluded areas where air defense systems are being resurrected.
We have already decided on buying a new air defense system, and we are looking into a second one.
We had no troops there, no equipment really for a number of years, but now it's coming back gradually. This has to do with the realization that anything happens in the Baltic Sea area, Gotland will be involved.
Gotland, which sits just 350 kilometers from the Russian enclave Kaliningrad, is pivotal for NATO's influence in Baltic states, where tension with their eastern neighbor has risen.
What they have in Kaliningrad is really scary to us. If they fire one of their missiles from Kaliningrad into Sweden, we have no air defense system that can handle this. Not a chance. It's a bit like we're back in the old days of the Cold War.
Back on the mainland, just outside of the capital Stockholm, Swedish forces are preparing for the final phase of the Aurora 17 war games. A ground invasion.
At its peak during the Cold War, Sweden boasted 800,000 troops and the fourth largest air force in the world. The show of force put on by these powerful weapons are warning shots that the country may again be a regional force to be reckoned with.
The Prime Minister and Defense Minister, who've spearheaded Sweden's military buildup, were on site to observe.
We're building a cooperation with other countries, signed several cooperation agreements, and we will keep on doing that. So it will strengthen Swedish capacity, yes.
And the reason is that we have had a Russian annexation of Crimea, we have a war going on in Ukraine, we have pressure towards the Baltic states, and we have more of activities in the Baltic Sea area. So this is an exercise in a new security environment.
Sweden's leaders acknowledge that military support from allies like the US, France, Denmark, Norway, and the Baltic states, who have all taken part in the games, are crucial. All are NATO members, but Sweden's government is wary of its war games being called a NATO exercise.
It's a bilateral arrangement with those countries participating here. It's not a NATO exercise.
Sweden has maintained a policy of neutrality for 200 years. Now that it's in the EU, the preferred term is non-alignment. But strengthening ties with NATO have raised concerns among some that its legacy of independence is slipping.
The government, especially the Social Democrats, they say we shouldn't join NATO, but they are all the time twinning us together with NATO. I once accused the defense minister, you're doing a political moonwalk. You're moving in one direction, but it looks like you're on the other direction, because your mouth is saying one thing, but your feet are saying something else.
Russian President Vladimir Putin has vowed to eliminate the NATO threat if Sweden were to join. For now, a country known for its role in diplomacy will have to walk a delicate line between military readiness and non-alignment, in a region seen as becoming more difficult to avoid taking sides. Randolph Nogel, the Newsmakers, from Sweden's Aurora 17 war games.
Well, to discuss this, I'm joined now from Fagersta in central Sweden by Stig Henriksson, who you would have seen in our report. He's a member of the Swedish Parliament with the Left Party. In Stockholm, we have Anna Wieslander. She's the Secretary General of the Swedish Defence Association. And with me here in the studio is journalist Teresa Christiansen. She writes for a Swedish daily newspaper. I thank you all for joining us. Anna Wieslander, let me begin with you. Tell me why you think Sweden needs or needed the Aurora 17 war games?
Well, Sweden had not exercised at this size for almost 20 years, so it was very much needed to have that. It's important for us to build up our military capability again when it comes to national defense. We had focused on international missions for a very long time, but we have not had that focus on national defense, and for that you need to exercise at large units and in cooperation with other countries.
Stig Henriksson, why can't it just be seen as a drill to keep Sweden secure, rather than, as some have said, oh no, this means 200 years of neutrality are now finished?
Well, I don't think 200 years of neutrality is finished, but I think it's not a good thing for Swedish security that we are sort of going even closer with NATO countries and having these sort of exercises. Of course, Sweden should have a national defense, and of course the national defense has to exercise. But having 6 NATO countries in this large scale, that isn't good for our security. The tension and the armament in the Baltic Sea region is increasing, and we shouldn't take part of that. We should do like Finland, our neighbor, who are not having these big exercises because they say this is not good. It's like putting oil to the fire.
Mm-hmm. Teresa, is this something that just happened right now in response to, say, the massive Russian drills that we saw in Belarus and elsewhere, or has this been a long time coming?
No, I mean, the relationship or the anti-relationship with especially Russia has been there for a long time. There has always been some sort of fear, you can say, for whatever Russia could do to Sweden. But also the relations with NATO or the non-relation has been up to discussion for several years, and it's kind of polarizing the population.
Anna, is the easiest solution for Sweden to just join NATO?
Well, there is no will in the present government to join NATO, so it's more of a theoretical question at this time. Neither the Social Democrats nor the Green Party are interested in that. So that is a political discussion that is ongoing. As we said here, it's polarized in that the government has one opinion and the opposition parties have another opinion. They think we should join NATO. Meanwhile, I believe it's important for Sweden's security to cooperate more closely with NATO, as we have been doing in close cooperation also with Finland for the past few years when it comes to Baltic Sea security. That increases security in the whole region.
Mm-hmm. Stig, it's interesting within the domestic political space, you and the far right, I guess, are interesting bedfellows here on this issue because you're both against it, even though you fundamentally disagree on many other things. But wouldn't you accept the fear from many others where they see Russian encroachment in Ukraine, they see Russia swallow up Crimea, they see Russia conduct war games in the Baltics and threaten these other countries? Don't you understand why perhaps your fellow countrymen feel they need to take all precautions and they need to maybe get help from further west if they don't have enough firepower?
Most people in Sweden, one has to say, is against the membership in NATO. That is an important thing for us. And of course, we are very critical to the Putin regime, what they're doing in Crimea and in Ukraine. But that doesn't consist that there is a threat against Sweden in that case. We have had 200 years of being out of military alliances, and we had over 200 years of peace. So it's a heavy burden on those who say, now we should change the scenario completely. Mm-hmm. Russia has always been there. Russia has sometimes been aggressive, sometimes has it been a victim of aggression, but it's always been there. And I say we should continue that 200 years of being out of military alliances. It has served us very well.
Yeah, at the core of being a member of NATO is the fact that if there's an attack on one, there's an attack on all. That's why that collective security is so important. And there's a feeling that if you join NATO, that means that you have a bunch of friends if you're under attack. Gunnar Hult challenges that a little bit, the professor at Swedish Defense University. Let's have a little listen to what he said.
There is still a belief, long-term standing belief in Sweden that by not being in NATO, we can stay out of a future war. And to me, this is absolutely not true, because any future war in the Baltic area will involve Sweden one way or the other. And it doesn't matter that if you claim to be a neutral country, you're not part of any alliance, you will be part of that future war.
Teresa, do you think he makes a decent point there?
Well, I mean, it's also a fact that even if Sweden are not part of NATO, we are still very close to NATO. For example, Sweden was in the international operations in Afghanistan for many years, and that was a NATO operation in some way. It started like a UN operation, but it involved into something else, where there was a war going on. So I don't think it's exactly true that we haven't been, that Sweden hasn't been close to NATO, and the way they are now could possibly continue as well.
Anna, when you see the Russians conduct that massive drill as they did with Zapad 17 in Belarus, what is the message that you take out of it? Because the Russians say, hey, we're just doing a drill to protect ourselves, just as everybody else does, just as the Americans do, just as NATO does. What's the message to you? How is it received on your end?
The main message from my end is that Russia is, since a few years back, since after the war they conducted on Georgia, rebuilding their military capability at quite substantial pace. They are investing $700 billion US dollars from 2011 to 2020. And you can see now that they have a considerable military capability, and they are showing that in exercises as Zapad 17. So, and that is, of course, a signal to the rest of the region and to the world to see. They want us also to see, and also for them to exercise their capability. So that's important to notice, of course. And the critique that has come out from on Russia for the Zapad exercises is that it has lacked transparency on what they are aiming to do and how many forces they are about to exercise, and also invitation of observing partners.
Anna, is it a little paradoxical, maybe, that even if Russia wasn't being antagonistic by those drills in the past, maybe if we took them for their word, or took them at their word that they weren't being antagonistic, now that Sweden is conducting its own drills and maybe getting cozier with NATO, now Russia will be antagonistic, so it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy?
No, I think that's really not the case. It's important to see what came first when it comes to Russia, because this is a talk that is going on. But I think it's important to see that Russia first attacked Georgia in 2008. It started a massive military buildup. It has also attacked Ukraine, illegally annexed Crimea, started a war in eastern Ukraine. It has said that it does not want the European security order that we have established in Europe since 25 years back. It wants something else that reflects the fact that Russia thinks it's fair to have a sphere of influence among its neighbors. So there is a long range of indicators that shows that Russia is conducting a much more aggressive stance towards Europe and its neighbors, and they want a change. That's very, very apparent. That's also what they are saying. And we have to respond to that, because otherwise you are creating new imbalances. This is not how it looked after the fall of the Berlin Wall. We are in a more insecure situation in Europe, and if we do not respond to that, we will not reach a new level of stability.
Stig, Anna has laid out a compelling timeline. You can't disagree with that, can you?
Well, let me say first that Sweden has participating in two wars, in Afghanistan and Libya, both with results that are catastrophical. So I think that should be a signal too. And we're critical to the Russian armament, but still the Russian military expenditure is 1/10 of NATO's, less than 1/10 of NATO. So you have to have the proportions there. And of course, big military exercises are bad for the security situation in our region. Zapad 17 and Aurora 17 are both wrong in my view. But still, Russia isn't making their military exercises with Cuba outside the coast of Florida. They're making it near their homeland. And if there's somewhere you should have your military exercises, of course it should be around your own borders. But we have invited the United States to participate in our drill, and I think that's a completely different signal. And even if we don't think in Sweden that this is anything bad, it shouldn't raise the tension and so on, but it signals that we are almost a member of NATO. And let me say that it could be like that if there would be a war around the Baltic Sea, that we could be part of it even if we don't choose it. But if we are a member of NATO, we are participating in that war from day one. That's the only sure guarantee that NATO can give us.
Teresa, tell me how many Swedes would agree with Stig in saying that inviting the Americans along to conduct this drill is a bad idea?
Well, I think the people who is on his side, which would be a lot of people actually, that is against NATO, which I think it's changed over time, of course, depending who is the governments and who is the presidents, etc., in the NATO countries. But I think there are as many that feel the fear that if we go with NATO, that's a sign of provocation. There is a huge historical honor and pride in Sweden of being some sort of neutral and fighters for the human rights. And of course, people are worried that would need to take a step back if Sweden would take another step towards military operations instead.
Yeah, Anna, is that idealism hitting its natural ceiling now, where, okay, you can be a humanitarian superpower, as you call yourself, you can stay neutral, but only up until a point. At some point, you have to be like other countries, which means, I don't know, spending more on defense in order to keep yourself safe. Is that a natural progression for Sweden now?
Well, actually, it was said earlier here that there is an opposition, there is a majority against NATO membership in Sweden. That is not what the polls are showing since the past few years. There is actually a majority for, if you look at the polls, ranging from between 35 to up to 50% for NATO membership. But there is also a group between 25-35 against NATO membership, and quite a big group that are not sure what they believe in NATO membership. So there has been a big shift from the past. It used to be 25% for NATO membership, and now it's up more, I would say, average around 40% for NATO membership. So there has been a change. And why is that a change? Well, people have seen, and polls also show this, people are worried about the developments in Russia, Russian behavior. So that's one driving force abroad. A driving force within Sweden is that people are worried that our defense capability is too low. It's actually 70% that believe that Sweden should, defense capability is too low, that we cannot defend Sweden, and they are worried about that. So all these indicators, I believe, an exercise like Aurora, a big exercise, most people actually think it's a good thing. But there has been a very vocal, loud voices who are against it, but I don't think that reflects the majority of the Swedish people. There are no polls that support that. A third factor, which is important when it comes to should we practice with the US, invite France, our Nordic neighbors, our Baltic neighbors, is that we have a security policy which is adopted by Parliament and all political parties, that Sweden should be able to give and take military support in case of a crisis. We do not have a defense policy that builds on Sweden defending solely itself. We should be able to give and take military support, and that's why we are exercising a national exercise together with other countries. And there is an interesting poll as well showing that actually 66% of the Swedes believe that if there is a crisis or war, Sweden will get fast and efficient help from abroad. And that is what 2/3 of the Swedes believe in. And that's also congruent with how we are exercising and how we are building our defense.
Stig, let me ask you, is your country changing? When we look at the opposition to Aurora, the best count that I could come across of those who took to the streets in opposition, usually from the left, were about 400 people. So with that in mind, I'll ask my last question to you. Is your country changing before your eyes? Is the idealism fading, and is Sweden starting to act more like, I don't know, other regular countries?
No, I don't think it's a question of idealism. We're very realistic and looking at the history.
Go ahead, Stig.
Excuse me, can I answer the question? Yes, and I was myself speaker in a meeting in Gothenburg, and we were 3,500 people there protesting against Aurora 17, so there had been a lot of massive protests. Then I and Anna perhaps see different polls. I have only seen one poll that more are in favor of NATO membership than against. But then again, it's not idealism. It's security policy is so much more than just looking at the military defense. Of course, we should have a military defense and it should be good and strong, but the very important part of security policy, it's diplomacy, it's trying to get disarmament, it's trying to get negotiations and lessen the tension in the region. And now the tension, and we are participating in rising the tension all the time, and that is a very bad thing for Swedish security. That's my point.
Mm-hmm. So, Teresa, let me ask you then very finally, with whatever Russia has done, whether it's seen as antagonistic or not, have the Russian actions and now the reactions from Sweden been a healthy test of Sweden trying to define what it wants to be in security policy and foreign policy in the years going forward?
Well, I think that depends which side you would ask. If it was a provocation towards Russia, or if it actually shows what Russia would do if there were actual threat. But of course, I mean, this was an honest military training that has been done before elsewhere. So in that way, I think it was a kind of an obvious response from Russia.
Yeah, it's been great to talk to three Swedes about this. What does Sweden want? I'm a little bit closer in trying to understand, but I don't fully understand it yet. Fascinating covering your country as well. We don't often cover Sweden on the Newsmakers. Anna Wieslander, Stig Henriksson and Teresa Christiansen, I thank you all for joining us on the Newsmakers.